Twilight of an Empire. By Zhongwen and Boya. Chapter 13, National Debt, Deficits, and Fiscal Uncontrol. Opening. Dear listeners, today we're going to talk about a number. 39 trillion. On March 20, 2026, the total outstanding debt of the U.S. federal government reached that figure, $39 trillion. If you stacked that many $1 bills, the pile would reach more than 11 times the distance from Earth to the Moon. Even more alarming, this number is growing at a rate of roughly $3 billion per day. The interest payment tipping point, at a $39 trillion debt level, even with interest rates at around 4.5%, America's annual pure interest payments are already approaching $1.5 trillion. This means that for every $4 the U.S. government collects in taxes, more than $1 goes directly to creditors, just to service the money it has already borrowed. The slope of growth, U.S. debt grew from $34 trillion to $39 trillion in about 2 years. This trajectory means the U.S. is in the exponential phase of debt accumulation, not the linear phase. It is unsustainable. 1. A history of debt, from exception to norm. The U.S. government was not always so deeply indebted. For most of American history, maintaining fiscal balance, and even surpluses, during peacetime was a bipartisan fiscal principle accepted by both parties. Debt expanded sharply only during wartime, and was gradually repaid through fiscal discipline in the post-war years. At the end of World War II, U.S. debt to GDP ratio reached approximately 120%, an all-time high. But over the following 2 decades, with rapid economic growth and relatively strict fiscal discipline, that ratio fell to about 35% by the late 1960s. The turning point came in 1981. The Reagan administration, invoking supply-side economics, enacted massive tax cuts while maintaining or even increasing military spending. The result was a peacetime structural deficit on an unprecedented scale. The fiscal legacy of the Reagan Revolution was the first major expansion of U.S. debt. From that point onward, whether under Democratic or Republican administrations, the long-term trajectory of debt has been consistently upward. The Clinton era produced a brief fiscal surplus, but that was an exceptional period driven by the dot-com boom's revenue surge and post-Cold War defense cuts. It did not last. Bush's tax cuts and 2 wars sent deficits soaring again. Obama's stimulus spending in response to the financial crisis further inflated the debt. Trump's tax cuts and COVID relief programs pushed debt to new heights. Biden's large-scale infrastructure and subsidy bills continued along the same track. 2. Why is fiscal uncontrol so hard to reverse? To understand the core of America's fiscal uncontrol, one must grasp a basic paradox of political economy. In a democracy, increasing spending is politically rewarding, while cutting spending or raising taxes is politically costly. Rational politicians therefore systematically favor the former. Of total federal spending, roughly 2/3 is mandatory spending, primarily Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. These programs are the safety net on which tens of millions of Americans depend. Any cuts provoke fierce political backlash. With an aging population, these 3 programs are destined to consume an ever-growing share of GDP. Add in interest payments, which, as debt and rates have risen, exceeded $1 trillion in 2024 for the first time ever, surpassing even defense spending, and the structural pressure on federal finances is systemic, not cyclical. On the revenue side, U.S. taxes are relatively low by developed country standards, particularly corporate and high-income taxes. Every few years brings a new round of tax cut discussions, while any tax increase proposal is almost certain to meet blanket Republican opposition. Neither party is willing to squarely face the reality of the structural gap between revenue and spending. 3. Dollar hegemony, amulet or anesthetic? A key question is, why hasn't America's enormous debt triggered a fiscal crisis of the kind seen in other countries? The answer is the U.S. dollar's reserve currency status. Most global trade is denominated in dollars, and most nations hold the dollar as the dominant share of their foreign exchange reserves. This means global demand for dollars is persistent, and the U.S. can borrow at extremely low cost, foreign governments and investors are willing to hold U.S. treasuries at relatively low yields because they are viewed as the world's safest asset. This privilege, which French President Charles de Gaulle called America's exorbitant privilege, allows the U.S. to sustain long-term trade deficits and fiscal deficits without suffering the immediate market penalties that other countries would face. But this amulet is not permanent. In recent years, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and others have accelerated efforts to de-dollarize commodity transactions. Central bank purchases of gold have hit record highs. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has slowly declined from roughly 70% at its peak to about 59% today. The trend is slow, but the direction is clear. If the dollar's reserve status begins to falter, the low-interest borrowing environment on which U.S. fiscal policy depends will disappear, and a true crisis will follow. 4. Historical patterns of debt crises. Throughout history, national debt crises have tended not to unfold linearly, they arrive suddenly. Long-accumulated debt burdens may remain superficially stable for extended periods, then suddenly collapse upon a triggering event, a financial shock, a crisis of confidence, a geopolitical upheaval, at speeds far exceeding anyone's expectations. 16th-century Spain, sustained for a century by a steady flow of American silver, repeatedly declared national bankruptcy once its debt reached a critical threshold, and ultimately fell from its position as world hegemon. Late 18th century France saw its fiscal collapse directly trigger the French Revolution, plunging all of Europe into decades of turmoil. In modern times, Argentina and Greece are contemporary examples of debt crises leading to social upheaval. America's size and the dollar's unique status mean it will not easily reach such a point. But the directional similarity is enough to put historians and economists on high alert. 5. No political will for reform. Solving America's fiscal dilemma is not technically complicated, it comes down to raising taxes, cutting spending, or some combination of the two, supplemented by increasing economic growth. But politically, it is nearly impossible. Republicans refuse to raise taxes. Democrats refuse to cut social programs. Neither party is willing to make truly painful fiscal adjustments under electoral pressure. Every debt ceiling negotiation becomes a game of brinkmanship, ending at the last minute with a temporary patch that solves nothing fundamental, kicking the problem to the next Congress. This structural political impotence is the most despairing aspect of America's fiscal problem. Knowing where the disease lies but being unable to operate is a deeper predicament than not knowing the cause at all. Conclusion. A nation's debt problem is, at root, a political problem, a question of how responsibility is distributed between the current generation and future generations. How much of today's prosperity is borrowed from tomorrow's resources? Are today's politicians willing to answer to creditors 20 years from now? When the answer is no, the historical symptom of fiscal exhaustion in the 300-year rise and fall cycle is already clearly visible. Thank you for listening.